Just a few more seconds. Okay, I think we are now ready to start. So thank you again very much for joining us today for another How to Get Published webinar. This time we're going to be looking into peer review in honor of Peer Review Week. So I am going to very briefly present our team today. So I'm going to start with Jessica Lapowski, who is a publishing editor on the Sage Journal's editorial team. She works closely with editors and societies to help navigate the publishing process and develop key strategies. We also have today Brittany Stewart, who has worked in publishing since 2017 and is now a peer review manager at Sage Publishing. Since joining Sage in 2020, she has supported the peer review team and has made a number of contributions to both the systems and support functions of the team. She has provided peer review management support and has a rich understanding of publication ethics and peer review best practice. Next, we have Dr. Jill L. Adelson, who is the president and CEO of Adelson Research and Consulting, LLC, which specializes in advanced quantitative research methods, program and grant evaluation, and gifted education practices. She just completed a 5-year term as co-editor of Gifted Child Quarterly, where she and her co-editor were at the forefront of implementing transparency and open science practices into the journal. Next, we have Victoria L. Crittenden, who is Professor of Marketing and Babson Research Scholar at Babson College. In addition to having published over 100 articles in marketing and management journals, she is currently the editor of the Journal of Marketing Education published by Sage. And finally, there's me, Maria Tissot. I am marketing manager in the author marketing team at Sage, and my work is focused on helping early career researchers get published. So during this webinar, you will be able to send your questions in to us using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to leave around 15 to 20 minutes to answer your questions. And if we are not able to answer all questions, we will follow up later on with you. So don't worry, we're going to answer as many questions as we can today. So I'm going to now pass it on to Jessica to start the presentation.
Great. Well, thank you, Maria, for that wonderful introduction. Happy Peer Review Week, everyone. We're really excited to be here today. So this chart outlines the overall publishing process, and today we're focusing specifically on peer review. So what exactly is peer review? Whoop, my screens have a mind of its own. So what exactly is peer review? Peer review is a process where scientists or peers evaluate the quality of other scientists' work. By doing this, the goal is to ensure that the work is rigorous, coherent, uses past research, and adds to what is already known. The process of peer review is an integral part of publishing one's research and absolutely essential to ensuring the quality of research published and adding to the research record. Peer review helps filter out poor quality articles, assesses the validity of science behind the manuscript, and helps maintain the scientific integrity. Additionally, it helps make already good quality manuscripts even stronger. So peer reviewers tend to be seasoned in their disciplines and well-versed in the scientific literature, and usually have a really good suggestions for authors. Over to you, Brittany.
Thanks. So in terms of how peer review works, I'd just like to share how that process looks like for the author and just highlight the core role peer reviewers provide. So after a paper is submitted to the journal's peer review system known as Sage Track here, it is checked for compliance with the journal's guidelines. So this may include things such as correct formatting, like the reference style, if an abstract is present, if there's a clear conclusion, and in some cases, if applicable, I guess, declaration and ethical statements. The paper will also be checked for fit within the journal's aims and scope. If it passes these checks, it's sent out to verifiable and independent reviewers most of the time. And in most cases, peer reviewers are matched to a paper based on keywords provided in the paper by the authors to keywords provided by the reviewer if they've created a reviewer account. In some cases, you can it'll also include keywords from the articles that reviewers have also authored. We typically look for someone with methods expertise and someone with content expertise. So some journals may also opt to include an editorial board member to review a paper. And if someone's work is cited within the paper, we may also reach out to them too. Once the required number of suitable reviewers have been selected, they are then invited to review. And once they accept that invitation, they will have access to the paper in their reviewer centre in SageTrack. Once reviewers have assessed the paper and prepared comments for the editor and authors, they then make a recommendation of revision, reject, or accept to the editor in the system. The editor can then go in and make a final decision based on the recommendation from the reviewers. Next slide, please. So there are three main types of peer review. We have single anonymous, double anonymous, and open, or sometimes known as transparent peer review. Single anonymous peer review is where the name of the reviewer is hidden from the author. Double anonymous means the names are hidden from both the reviewers and the authors. Open peer review, which is only embraced by a small handful of journals here at Sage, is when everyone is openly identified. If the journal embraces single or double anonymous peer review, reviewer confidentiality is strictly maintained, and our journal systems are set up to ensure anonymity is kept. Be sure to understand which type of peer review the journal you are submitting to uses, so you can properly anonymise your manuscript upon submission. And this should help to mitigate any chances of having your paper unsubmitted for non-compliance. So do look out for instructions on how to appropriately anonymise your paper in the journal submission guidelines. I'd just also like to add that sometimes our systems are set up so that you do have a separate title page to the main document. So look out for that as well. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, thank you. So in terms of the peer review process, as I previously mentioned, the majority of Sage journals uses the platform SageTrack, which is powered by ScholarOne. Some of you may also have heard it referred to as Manuscript Essential, which is typically used in the SageTrack URLs. Other common peer review platforms are Editorial Manager and Submittable, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. But in terms of the process, once a paper is submitted, the editor or the journal's administrator determines if it fits within the journal scopes. So you can find the aims and scopes on the journal website, and you should thoroughly review this to determine if your paper fits prior to submission. If the editor finds the paper doesn't fit within the aims and scope, or it isn't a good fit for another reason, perhaps the journal recently published a paper on the topic already, or perhaps the editor sees initial fatal flaws, the paper will be just rejected. If your paper is sent out for peer review, the editor or associate editor will invite 2 or more verifiable and external peer reviewers to review your manuscript. Reviewers conduct a thorough examination of the paper, and they review all aspects, including and especially the methodology section. The peer review process can take significant time, and this is dependent on many factors, which we'll go into a little later. Nevertheless, if you log in to the manuscript submission portal, you might see that your paper status is pending peer review or undergoing peer review. So please allow time for this process to occur. Many reviewers are feeling time pressures at the moment, especially given today's current climate, and are doing their best to conduct peer review in a timely manner. Sometimes this can lead to the reviewer declining, and so the editor needs to then go in and source another suitable reviewer. So just be mindful of that. And if you do have any questions during the peer review process, just feel free to also contact the Journal Editorial Office for a status update, which you'll have their details on the Journal SageTrack site. If and once your paper passes that initial check, it will most likely be sent out to peer review. And as I previously mentioned, the paper is sent out to at least 2 or 3 reviewers who are subject experts in that field. And reviewers assess and they make recommendations to the editor of accept, reject, minor or major revisions. But ultimately, the editor makes that final decision and not the reviewers. So just again, be mindful of that. And Again, peer review takes time and it's not something that happens overnight. Reviewers spend hours on reviewing manuscripts, and they do this diligently. At Sage, we encourage you to consider peer reviewing papers as well. If you are new to the process, pair up with someone experienced or contact the journal's editorial office you're interested in reviewing for and ask for guidance. There are many benefits to being a reviewer, which we'll also go into a bit later, and Sage also has a variety of peer review resources available in our reviewer gateway, including a reviewer guide, information on how to get involved as an early career researcher, publishing ethics, and much more, and we'll link to that in later slides as well. Just very briefly in terms of reviewer ethics, I'd just like to note that many journals do use double anonymised peer review. Again, just to clarify, this means the authors don't know who the reviewers are and the reviewers don't know who the authors are. Confidentiality is strictly maintained, including participant anonymity. This helps the journal ensure that authors are not getting an unfair advantage or disadvantage because of who they are, so it reduces that bias, and the reviewers are comfortable providing candid, honest feedback on all manuscripts in a safe, confidential manner. I'll just pass over to Jessica now. Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany. So next, we're going to talk about the evaluation criteria a reviewer should keep in mind when reviewing an article. And this is important from an author's perspective so that you know how your manuscript might be reviewed when it's undergoing peer review. At Sage, the phrase used is research done well to describe the bar for publication. So the specifics will vary between fields and disciplines, but this is how we explain it to journal editors. We did want to mention that some journals allow authors to write a registered report. Phase 1 submission would come before conducting the research and would still be peer reviewed. And then phase 2 submission would come after conducting the research and include also that paper review and peer review. So please keep in mind the criteria that we're going through today may vary on discipline and article type. With that, I am going to pass it over to you, Vicki.
Okay, thanks to all of y'all for being a part of this session, and I'm honored to be here with these group of panelists. And I want to talk initially about the first impressions of your paper. And I'm a marketer, so I think a lot about first impressions, whether it's about a paper or a presentation I'm giving or other people's papers or presentations they're giving. So first impressions are key. And first impressions are very important to us as authors when we're submitting our papers for peer review. Because when a reviewer is evaluating your manuscript, it is almost impossible to not think about certain characteristics of academic writing style, things that we should be thinking about in our own writing and presentation. And I often refer to this as a negative halo effect, because I review a lot of papers, and I know that if I get stuck with a negative first impression, I have a really difficult time dropping that to really explore the content of the paper. So here are just 4 things that we want you to think about in terms of first impressions. One is the academic writing style. Every field has its own preference as far as style. You get that, you get a feel for that by reading work in your own field, and you can acquire that over time. But I think as a new author in particular, it's so important to really look at that writing style. And in doing that, try to avoid being colloquial. And someone asked me once, so what does it mean to be colloquial? And sometimes I'll say, I'm not colloquial, but I know it when I see it in an academic paper. Maybe I'm colloquial when I'm talking with my friends, but I wouldn't say something the same way in an academic paper. A problem that I see a lot in first impressions with papers, and I'm in the Boston area of the USA, I'll see a paper come in and they'll say they derive their sample from the West Coast. The journal I'm the editor with is an international journal, and the West Coast doesn't have meaning to a lot. It doesn't have the same meaning to everyone who's in our audience. So try to avoid even regionalism in your writing. So I'll send papers back saying, why don't you say the western coast of the USA? To try to put things in perspective. So think about writing style. We don't ask our reviewers to copy edit papers for authors, but as an reviewer and as simultaneously as an author, I have a very difficult time not critiquing writing style. And again, if you can send us something that is written as well as it can be, then we know that our reviewers are not getting lost in the quality of the writing, the quality of the language. Little things that I think about are, singular and plural consistency across subjects and verbs. You would be surprised at how often we all inadvertently make those mistakes, but just be sure to follow up to make sure that your sentence construction is coming across strongly. We look for cohesiveness. You might be surprised at how often I get comments that are confidential to the editor that say, this paper was not cohesive. It didn't flow well. I think there might be something there, but it may just go back to the fact that you didn't use correct headers in your paper. So there are just those types of things that you could think about structurally as a first impression. I was told a doctoral student, and right now I know I'm telling this to almost it could be over 1,000 people right now, so I have to be really careful. I have felt like sometimes that I've made it through the first round of review because the paper I wrote was very well written. So therefore, the comments from the reviewers were able to facilitate my research content and my methods and my results and explicating those results and the impact instead of getting bogged down in the academic writing. So that's the strongest advice I can give and that I give to doctoral students is write it well, and then your reviewer comments can spend the time making everything else about the paper better. And your reviewers will be willing to do that if you have written a good paper. The fourth first impression that we look at in today's society is bias-free and inclusive language. I spend a lot of time with my students talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in marketing, and this really comes through also in our writing. In today's world, thankfully, we have to be so sensitive to labels. We have to think about people come from multiple identities, and even when people share an identity, it doesn't mean they share the same experiences. And so this goes beyond even our word choices. It goes into our methodologies, the intention and design of the study, the sampling that we're using. So what I want everyone to think about is the first impression of that paper. And when you submit that paper, what first impression are you wanting to leave with people? Okay, the next slide, please. So when you think about this and overall, when we look at the first impression, I, as an editor, and then once it passed the desk, me, then if I send it out to the reviewer is going to look initially to see if you followed proper reporting guidelines. So if you've collected data from students, did you follow the process, so that in the US we have to follow our review board guidelines to say that we had permission to collect this data? Did we clear the screening that a respondent was over 18 years old and participated in the study of their own free will? And so we look for those proper reporting guidelines, because if a researcher didn't follow those, then that calls into doubt as to whether or not this paper can ever be published. We look for a clear contribution to the field. I'll share this with you on the way that one of my co-editors for a previous journal I was working with, and this person was also a very strong mentor for me when I came out of my doctoral program. He said, "Vicki, you always want a nugget. There needs to be a nugget in any paper that's submitted. And if an author submits paper that has a nugget, I as an editor look for that nugget. I as a reviewer look for that nugget. I try to say, there is something of value here. And if I as a reviewer can work with the author through my reviewer comments to really build out on that nugget, then I have the responsibility to do that." And I spend a lot of time with our editorial review board, sending papers out, and sometimes they'll go through 2, 3, 4 revisions, and that's because the review team feels so strongly that the nugget is being developed over time. The research doesn't always have to be novel. Sometimes we're just extending on research that's already out there. So we're extending the contributions of others. And that has to be very clear, but that extension, I think of it as a willingness to pay, and that the reader has to be willing to want to read this paper because the extension is substantial enough to make a difference in our field. And it's up to the author to convey that. Third thing that we look for is the literature review and the references. What you're writing about has to tie to the literature. And I speak quite a bit on theory development, but I can tell you, very few of us start with a blank slate. We start with what I refer to on the shoulders of those who came before us, and that's the literature. And our review team they do not look favorable upon papers that are submitted that tend to imply this is the first time something's ever been done, because we do have so many strong theories and we have a lot of literature in most things. So it's great if you can be first, but the odds are against you. Just if you can show you're building on the shoulders of those others, your review team is going to look at that strongly. And make sure you reference correctly. You may not think that people do this, reviewers do this, but they do. Is that if you cite someone in your paper, make sure that appears in your reference list. The reviewers get really irritated if you cite, let's just say, I'll say you cite Crittenden, but they can't go to Crittenden. Sometimes they want to look at that source, and there's a lot of technology out there that facilitates being able to do that easily, but don't trust just the technology. I'm surprised when I look at a reference list and there's so many errors in it, even though I know the person relied on technology, because technology is not going to supplant your responsibility as an author. And the fourth thing, which may seem like we're getting a little tedious and in the weeds, but as a reviewer, our reviewers get in the weeds on these things, is that a common critique, or I guess you will, a concern that I would hear back from the review team is that the reviewer cannot figure out your figure or your table, something's not coming through clearly. Personally, as an editor, I try to catch those and unsubmit the paper and send it back to the author before it ever reaches the review team. I'm only human and I don't catch all that. And so when I get comments from reviewers that they don't understand what the table is, or the review or the figure is blurred, I feel like I hold some responsibility because I let it slip through. But the author also has the first level of responsibility on this, because you should look over your own PDF file before that final step in the process. And so again, it goes to first impressions. That first impression is your responsibility. So I think I'm going to stop on that and hand it over. I think Jill's coming after me with methods. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Vicki. So when it comes to looking at the methods and data analysis, there are a few key items that reviewers tend to focus on. And first, what I want to start by saying is be sure to present your research questions and your hypotheses for your study. These should connect the literature review and conceptual framework you presented with the study you conducted. The reviewers are going to be examining whether the methods used were appropriate to answer the questions you asked. So be upfront and be clear about what were the questions you asked. What were the research questions guiding your study? I can't tell you as an editor how many times peer reviewers have come back and been like, I'm not sure exactly what they were trying to study because they don't put forth their research questions. So have in your paper, here are the research questions and here were our hypotheses. In terms of what they're looking for, one of the very first things is flaws in the study design. Are there any clear concerns with the way in which the study was conducted? Is it similar to how other studies in the field are conducted? Are you aware of the prior research and how it's been done? You may even have a section in the literature review addressing how this is similar or different from how other studies in this area have been conducted and why. Do the results and conclusions seem appropriate given the kind of study that were conducted? Then thinking about the materials and the methods, are they descriptive enough that the study could be reproduced? Most people have heard about the reproducibility crisis in psychology, and there are other fields that are also finding some of the same things. And so we want to be sure that the research we're putting out there is reproducible, that someone else can see exactly what we did in terms of conducting the research and the analyses. So check through there, make sure that it's very clear what you've done. Open Science, the Center for Open Science, has a lot of resources on this, and you can consider posting some of your methods and your materials on the Center for Open Science webpage, or you could do it as an appendix, Figshare through Sage. You can put it on an appendix and it gets a DOI there. And so that other people, you don't have room in your article to put your whole code for your analyses, or if you're doing qualitative, the different coding structure that you use to analyze the results. But you could do that as an appendix or put it up on an independent website so that it is available and someone could replicate what you did. So consider different ways you can present this both in the text and other resources. So again, think about that. And then, are the statistical techniques relevant to the study? Are they the standard for that kind of study? One thing I see often is an author who knows that they should be using a certain technique, but will even come back and say to me, but I don't know how to do that. So if it's not your strength, if you're, I have clusters and I need multi-level modeling, or I'm doing qualitative and I've never done this type of qualitative study before, collaborate with someone else, especially consider methodologists. The sooner you involve them in the study, the better your study is going to be, because if they can be involved in the design process, it will help with the analysis process as well. So if you're struggling with that part, think about adding someone in there, because this is a really big thing. As was mentioned earlier, as editors, we typically invite at least one person who is a methods expert and knows about the methods you are using, and they're checking to see, did you do the methods well? So you have to write it well so they can see what you did. If it's a quantitative method, we want to see your equations in a lot of the journals so that they can check that. And then we're going to we in the peer reviewers are going to be checking, is it relevant? Is it appropriate? So making sure that you've done that due diligence, because no one likes when they get their peer review back and it's, you need to reanalyze all your data. Yeah, you did all this work, but you chose the wrong statistical technique, or you didn't do it appropriately. Now you have to go back and reanalyze it. So that kind of also goes back to reproducibility, is making sure you know what you did, because the reviewers are going to ask questions and you want to be able to say, oh yes, I used this type of estimation method, or I made this decision for this reason. So you have to also know what were the steps you did and be able to go back and reproduce them and possibly change them later. This is where, as was mentioned earlier, registered reports are nice, because if you do that, you get peer review on your methods before you actually conduct them. And then you can go conduct them instead of them coming back later and saying, no, go back and do it a different way. And finally, are the materials and methods used for the study appropriate for the research questions being asked? Reviewers are going to be looking at, what assessment or questionnaire did you use? What were the questions you asked for your focus group? So they're looking at not just the statistical techniques, but everything that went into conducting the study. And that leads us to the results, discussions, conclusions, and limitations. A lot of the questions raised in analyzing the materials and method are going to flow over into results, discussions, and conclusions, because they all should be connected together. And that's the very first thing, is making sure that when you jump to your discussion, that you are connecting what you did with what you found and connecting that back with the literature. So think about, are the results presented in a way that emphasize the findings? Am I bringing that out? And then am I connecting that back with the literature? A big issue we see coming through in the different journals I've worked on is people making causal claims in their discussion when their research design was not causal. So be careful about the language you use. If it's a correlational study and correlations decided based on the research design, not based on what method of analysis you used, then you have to talk about the results in a correlational way, not this caused this, or because they did this, this happened. So be careful, because it can be very subtle, and reviewers often are very savvy and pick up on that. And they're like, no, you can't say this causes that, even if you didn't use the word cause. So be very careful about the language that you're using. So make sure you don't have unsupported generalizations. Think about who your sample is. Who can you generalize to? Think about what methods you used and materials. What instrument did you use? Can we generalize it to other instruments or not? So being very careful not to go beyond your findings. So we want to talk about how this fits in with the literature, but not to go beyond it, not to make assumptions that aren't appropriate. We want to make sure that in a study, the limitations are acknowledged. So what are those limitations? To the sample, to the method that you use, to the materials, and then directions for future research. Again, this is going to connect back to the literature review you did, and going to connect kind of with your limitations too. This is what I was able to do, but now we need future research, especially those things that you found that are unique. We want to make sure that those are reproducible. So thinking about future research in that way. So there's a lot of things that the reviewers are thinking about when they look at your article, and a lot of things you should be thinking about as you write that article. So break down your paper into the sections and think about it kind of from a reviewer perspective of what they're looking for. And then a reviewer is also going to break down when they review it and look at different sections. Many of my reviewers will write out, introduction and have comments, and, lit review and have comments. So you might see that actually come through when you get your parts from the reviewers. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to talk about ethics.
Thank you, Jill. So earlier we did touch on ethics a little bit, but this has to do with more so the ethical guidelines you should follow when performing the study and writing the article. So specifically, reviewers will look for how and when informed consent was obtained, or who gave ethical approval. So you'll want to make sure that you have all of those forms and permissions on file, whether that's from your institutional review board or another entity that might be granting that ethical approval, maybe from your hospital or organization to conduct that study. A great resource, which we link out to, is the Equator Network, and that has some great guidelines that you can follow and checklists depending on the type of study that you are conducting and what guidelines might need to be followed. You'll also want to make sure everything is anonymized. So that is not only for peer review, but also to protect those that were participating in your study or in the trials that you were conducting. So make sure that everything is anonymized. It was mentioned earlier that you might not only need to submit a separate document for anonymized peer review, but then you can also include some of this information on a title page or cover letter, depending on the requirements of the journal. That will all be in the submission guidelines. Definitely take a look at the submission guidelines before you go to submit your manuscript. That will be one of your best resources, and making sure you check all of these boxes. Lastly, in terms of ethics, the reviewers and the editors will be looking for data or image manipulation, maybe a p-value that's too perfect, or standard error bars that are consistent. We will have a webinar next year on image integrity, so we'll go into this in more detail, but just do your best to follow all of the ethical guidelines and reporting guidelines to make sure that you're doing things in the best possible way, that with the best practice. Like I said, we'll be covering this in the How to Conduct Peer Review webinar later this year, but we did want to highlight elements of a good reviewer report. So when you as an author get a reviewer report back, as Jill, Vicki, and Brittany have all covered, the reviewers will be assessing quality of the science, data, images, breaking it down possibly by headers and sections. And they'll be looking at the methods, the literature review, if it's reproducible or not, the conclusions, the limitations. We've gone through all of this so far. But those reviewers will strive to make it easy to understand, make it easily digestible for you as the author. A lot of times they'll be in a logical order to provide those comments and concerns or suggestions for improvement. And then when you as the author go to submit your comments back, for instance, if you did receive a decision of either acceptance or pending major or minor revisions, you can go back and address those peer review comments one by one. So they'll highlight both the strong and weaker points. We also, as Brittany mentioned, reviewers really are facing a lot of demands on their time and schedule. So there are a lot of constraints there. Reviewers are striving to turn that report around in a quick timeline, but do be patient. Reviewers are doing their best to get that turned around, because we know that that timeline is crucial to everyone involved, for the author and the journal. As also mentioned, reviewers are making the recommendations to the editor, and the editor has the final ultimate decision. Over to you, Brittany.
Thanks, Jessica. So in terms of why papers get rejected before review, so your article might flat out be rejected due to the methodology section alone. So like Jill and Vicky reinforced, be sure that your method section is strong and that you have thoroughly conducted a literature review. It may be that the manuscript doesn't fit within the journal's aims and scope, or perhaps, like I said before, the editor recently published a similar paper and wants to space out the content of those papers. So before you even submit, make sure your paper fits within the journal scope. If you're not sure if it fits, I would suggest reading other papers published in the journal to get an idea of the type of articles that they publish. Maybe you're submitting a case report. Perhaps the journal doesn't actually accept case reports as an acceptable article type. So your paper might just be rejected right off the bat because of that. Oftentimes manuscripts will be rejected if the manuscript needs significant editing, like in terms of spelling and grammar, which Vicky mentioned earlier. So whilst our copy editing team will perform basic editing, if the manuscript isn't easily digestible or readable for the peer reviewers, the editor will request that the manuscript receive additional editing before being considered for peer review. Sage provides language and editor services for a fee, though, and you can find out more on our Author Gateway services about that. If the paper is not rejected, it might be unsubmitted for you to make various formatting updates and meet the formatting requirements for the journal. Please understand that this is not reject, but it will slow down the peer review process. So that's why it's crucial that you read those guidelines. Unlike a reject decision, when you resubmit the article, the journal's SageTrack site will not make you fill out the submission portal steps all over again, which can be quite a cumbersome process. But once you make those corrections, which will be outlined in the unsubmit email that is sent to you, you can resubmit to the journal. The editor will then decide if the paper should be just rejected or continue and be sent out with peer review. The acceptance rate for journals can vary, ranging from 5% to 50%, depending on the journal's discipline and topic. Some journals like Nature and Science have a very high rejection rate simply due to the number of submissions received. Even if you want to publish in a high impact factor journal, remember that it's more important to focus on the readership of the journal and who your audience is. You might end up publishing in a niche journal in your field, but then your article reaches the right audience. So even if a journal has that high impact factor, it doesn't necessarily mean your article will receive a high number of citations. So do bear that in mind. And you as the author team still need to promote your work following publication to ensure your sharings and your findings get sent out to others within that field as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of why papers get rejected after review, once a paper goes through peer review, it doesn't actually mean that your paper, it doesn't guarantee an acceptance, and you may face possible rejection. In this instance, the reviewers were probably not convinced of the contribution to the knowledge base. Perhaps the methods are not robust enough for the journal, or specific sections are weak. A weak methodology could be, for example, too few observations on quantitative papers or lacking transparency of qualitative methods. Maybe your paper was ill-focused or fundamentally flawed in their opinion. Editors rely on 2 or 3 external peer reviewers for advice and judgment to help them inform their final decision. If a paper is rejected, the editor will send you the reviewer comments so you can further improve your paper. In some journals, whether your paper has been through peer review or not, the editor may decide to refer your paper to SagePath, our article transfer service, which will help match your paper with a more appropriate journal from our database. So this may be for cases where the journal has a very high rejection rate due to the number of submissions received, or if your paper is out of scope for that journal. And I'll just pass over to Vicky now, to discuss how to handle those reject decisions.
If you've had a paper that's been rejected, we've all been there. You know, as academics, as scholars, we've all had rejections. And I know this sounds trivial, but you have to remember you cannot take it personally. The anonymity behind the review process means you don't have to take it personally, but it is your research, so there is that personal component there. And again, we've all been there. And the criticisms by the reviewers are actually there to so that you are able to enhance your paper. You know, in any case, just make sure that you read those reviewer comments and those editors' letters. Focus on why your paper was rejected and what you will need to do to make your research and/or your research presentation better. Sometimes maybe you read the comments and the research is solid, but you just didn't convey how solid it is. Sometimes the research is solid, but you just didn't position your research appropriately for when the reviewer was was reading that, and I went through that just recently. I read the reviewers' comments and went, but I've done this. And then I realized what my problem was is I hadn't positioned it. So in that case, I've had to resubmit elsewhere, which I did. But if you get a rejection in most of our journals, unless the editor is telling you this will have to be changed so significantly that I will let you resubmit to the journal. Many of our journals, once it's rejected, you cannot ethically resubmit that exact same research to that journal again. So you're going to go elsewhere. So make sure that when you resubmit elsewhere, that the paper is stronger. Interestingly enough, and when I say stronger, you may not be able to address all the reviewers' comments from the rejection paper, but do the best you can. They're there for a reason. Reviewers really took their time to do that. And what is really important to remember is that, particularly in today's world, we live in a very small community. So if you're writing on a topic, I'm just going to throw out student cheating, how's that? There's a good chance if your paper got rejected at one journal in business and you resubmit it, there is a good chance at least one of those reviewers is going to be reviewing for the other journal. And so I review for a dozen journals right now. So that's on review boards. And so another journal, you might get that same reviewer. Again, it's still anonymous, but it's the same reviewer. And the thing I hate to see as an editor is when the reviewer comes back and says, yeah, I've already reviewed this paper once and the author didn't make any changes. And so that's what you have to really be careful with is we do all get rejected, and take those comments, take those criticisms, take those suggestions as they're intended to make your paper better. All right, and then I think we'll move to the next slide.
Yep,
yeah.
I'm jumping in now. Thanks, Vicki.
Oh, okay, sorry.
That's all right. And I second what Vicki said as an editor and as someone who's on multiple review boards. Seeing the same paper come in with no revisions is, red light. Like getting a review from a peer reviewer that says, I already did this, here you go. Like it's super easy and fast for them, but then what do we do with that? Clearly someone else already rejected it based on the same exact review. So do take the time to make those changes. But if you have a revision, which depending on the journal, there are different levels. It could be a major revision or an accept pending revision or a minor revision. So kind of different levels. And I want to step back just one moment because I did see in our Q&A several people asking about what happens when reviewers make different recommendations. And in some journals, you can see what those recommendations are. Sometimes you can't. But so it's ultimately up to the editor to decide how they're going to make the decision, whether it's invite revisions, reject, or accept. And they're going to take many things into consideration. This isn't kind of a democratic vote. Okay, you got 2 accepts and 1 rejects, so we're going to accept, because the editor is going to take many things into consideration. The expertise of the reviewer that gave that particular feedback. Is it the methods person commenting on methods, or is it a substantive person who thinks they have a methods comment, but the methods person didn't think that was an issue? The level of concern with the issue, there could be someone who saw a fatal flaw that the other person said accept and just didn't see that fatal flaw. And the editor sees, yes, that's a fatal flaw. We can't move forward with that. Also, most journals will have a section for peer reviewers to provide confidential comments to the editor. So there may be some other pieces that came into that decision. So they're going to do a more holistic review, not just who said accept, how many said accept, how many said reject. And so if you make it to that next round, do know that it's extremely rare to just get accepted without revisions. Very, very rarely does that happen. You likely are going to have to make revisions to your paper. And also getting a decision that is inviting revisions does not necessarily mean it will be accepted. It is an invitation to revise, not necessarily there are accept pending revisions, but major revisions does not mean it will necessarily be accepted. It means there's potential to be accepted later. So read the reviewer's comments and the editor's letter very carefully. You may need to read them and then step away for a day or two and come back to them, especially those reject letters, but also the major revision letters. Pay particular attention to the editor's comments. They may tell you what to focus on in the revisions, especially if there are some conflicting peer review comments in there. They may address that for you. Whether submitting to the same journal or a different journal, do your best to make the recommended changes as we've talked about. Follow the time frames requested. So if they want it back in 2 months, get it back in 2 months. If it's 2 weeks, that's usually a set pending minor revisions, then, get it back in that timeline. If for some reason you can't make that timeline, reach out early to the editor and talk to them about it. I had someone who recently was going to be going into labor and could not do it. And so, we're reasonable, but if you're asking for an extension of a year, well, then can we really go back to those same peer reviewers and ask them to review again? So follow those timelines the best that you can. Then clearly demonstrate what you changed point by point. In the journal that I just finished editing, we actually sent our authors a document that has a table with just 2 columns. And we say, put the reviewer comments in the table. Each comment gets its own row in the table, and then we want how you addressed it. And you could do that with any journal that you resubmit to. So here's editor or reviewer point, here's how I addressed it. If you can't address it, or you don't think it's appropriate to address it, then you need to explain why. And you need to do this in a very professional way, not just, you are wrong, this is how you do it. You need to be professional in how you address why you did it the way you did, and you're not going to change it, or you don't think it's appropriate to change it. Provide citations if you need to. Don't just address these issues in that separate document. Make sure you also make the changes in your manuscript. So the reviewers are saying, I don't know why you did this, or I don't know why you didn't do that. Then it should be clear to the new reviewers or the readers when it gets published why those things happen. So you need to make sure you've explained it to the reviewer, but also make the changes in your document. The be positive and polite, I kind of already talked about. It's always nice when the comments, even I've seen authors even include the positive things and say, thank you very much for this, just so it's not only focused on the negative, or not negative, but the things that need to be changed or addressed. Some journals do let you highlight changes in the document, which can make it easier for the reviewer and editor to compare kind of point by point what you revised, either doing track changes or highlights or colored text. And if you do that, also submit a clean version of it. But that's going to vary journal to journal, because some journals do not want a marked up copy. So make sure you read that letter carefully again, because the editor's letter will give you guidance on what they want resubmitted. The process may take 2 to 3 iterations. So you may get an invitation to submit a revision, and then the decision could come back and say, oh, we have new revisions. Especially sometimes the reviewers can't see an issue because it wasn't clear in the first paper. So then when you give more explanation, they're like, oh, now we see this issue. And so it may take several iterations. I know someone asked in the Q&A, if it keeps getting asked to do revisions, is it more likely to be accepted? And I know my work and most of my peers who are editors, we try to let it go or as early as possible if we don't think it's going to be published. We're not going to hold on to it for a second, a third revision if we don't think it's going to be published. Again, there's never a guarantee, especially something could come up, a fatal flaw that wasn't seen before because it wasn't clear in your paper. But the more they invite you to revise, the more likely it is they're saying, okay, this is getting closer. We think it has potential. That's what a revision is. We think this has potential. We're going to invest our time and our reviewers' time to this. In most cases, we try to go back to the same reviewers. They've seen it before. They know what those flaws are. They're going to go back. That's not always possible because life happens. People get busy. They're not available. If, for instance, I lost the methodologist, I may bring on another reviewer because I need that expertise if it's something I don't have or my associate editor doesn't have. So it's not necessarily the same peer reviewers, but most editors are going to try to keep those same peer reviewers for each iteration. So again, you want to be polite, you want to be positive because likely these people are going to be seeing it again. And so why would you review? Let's pass it on to Vicki to come back and talk a little bit about the benefits of being a peer reviewer.
So I know that we're almost out of time and there are a lot of questions, so I'll make this really quick. The benefits of being a peer reviewer for me, I have learned so much about research, and I think my research has gotten so much better because I am a reviewer. I review other people's papers, I see their mistakes, but at the same time, I see what these other authors have done really well, and I learn from that. So there is a personal service that comes from that, and there's the service to the field that says, as a reviewer, I am one of those guardians to make sure that the work that is published in our journals is solid and valid work. And I use this example quite often, even in my work outside of academia. So for someone, if you're an expert witness, you can say that that article went through a peer review, a double-blind review process, so we can trust those research results. We can trust that it was good, solid research. But it is such a strong service to the field. And one comment on that, if you're a really great reviewer, it actually puts you on track for an editorship someday. So how's that? So then I'm going to turn it over because there's so much recognition out there.
Thanks, Vicki. Yeah, so in terms of the recognition, there are many benefits for reviewing in this way. So this includes recognition via Web of Science Reviewer Recognition Service, which most of you know, which was, I guess, formerly known as Publons, and ORCID, where a reviewer can keep a record of publications and show which journals you've reviewed for. Recognition can also be shown with reviewer certificates, which we can provide upon request, and recognition can be displayed as professional development experience on a CV. Sage Publishing also offers some additional benefits to reviewers in recognition for their service, and this includes a 25% discount on Sage books and free access to ebooks and Sage journals for 60 days. And this is also outlined in any invitations that you get within Sage Track as well. So if an editor does invite you to review, all the recognition bits are included as well in some of those emails. And you can also find out more on our reviewer rewards page, which we'll also link out to. And just to follow on in terms of volunteering to review, there are two major ways you can start that journey and give back to your discipline. The first is to create an account on the journal's peer review site. Make sure a regularly checked email address is used. An institutional email address would be preferred, but we understand that this can't always be the case. So just put whatever is best and professional. Include a full affiliation, specify the degree or degrees you hold, and choose the appropriate salutation. You can also create or add an ORCID at this stage. One crucial thing to note is the adding of keywords. So strong keywords with correct spellings that best illustrate your research expertise is vital. Examples of good keywords and those to avoid are shown on the right. Good keywords are generally those that are descriptive, but not too descriptive. 1 to 3 words is generally okay. If the journal has a preset list of keywords provided, be sure to also use those, as authors may also use those when selecting keywords for their paper. And this can also help editors match reviewers with appropriate papers. It's also worth noting that if you have created a reviewer account for a specific journal, but have an interest in a different journal, your reviewer account won't transfer over, so you'll need to create another account and select a new set of keywords appropriate for that journal. The second way to become a volunteer reviewer is by connecting with editors. A reviewer may consider reaching out to editors directly via email. Many have their email addresses on the journal's website, so do look out. Or by creating a Web of Science reviewer recognition account. And we have a number of networking resources that are available on our author gateway, so do take a look if you are interested. Thanks, Jessica. So just to briefly touch up on conducting a peer review, and for those of you who want to learn more details about how to conduct a peer review and put together an effective report, Sage offers a number of resources on the Sage Journal Reviewer Gateway, our How to Review Articles page, downloadable reviewer's guide, and how to conduct peer review videos on there, and offers guidance and breakdowns on the elements of the peer review, such as how to assess a manuscript and what to do. Sage also partners with Web of Science Reviewer Recognition and recommends their Reviewer Academy, which is also linked on the Gateway. The Academy is a free of charge formal training course providing researchers with the skills, connections, and experience required to become an expert reviewer, with learning modules, practical experience, writing reviews, feedback on reviews, and also a certificate and badge on a reviewer's profile upon completion of the course. So lots of resources available to help aid you in your reviewer journey.
Yeah, and it's great to take a look at how to conduct peer review, because as we've all sort of mentioned, that author and peer reviewer component definitely overlaps in how you write your manuscript and how you take those revisions into stride. So these links will be circulated to everyone for your resources and review. To wrap up here, just to remind you, we have our next webinar coming up on October 19th on what it means to publish a paper open access, covering everything from APCs to transformative agreements and everything in between. So stay tuned for the next webinar. We also have a variety coming up in the rest of the year and into 2023 as well. We have a variety of resources that you can reference. Again, this will be circulated for your review. Unfortunately, we are out of time today, but we have answered some of the questions that came up in our conversation, but we will be reaching out to you separately after the webinar, but we encourage you to take a look at the resources that we have put together. We are very thankful for your time and attention. Thank you. A very big thank you to all of the panelists here today for your wonderful insight, knowledge, and sharing your resources and education with our viewers today.
Thank you very much, everyone, and we will see you next month.